The rope of Augusta Fletcher's team went taut and screamed as the planks of the Pedra crossing bridge dropped away beneath her wagon's front wheels. And for one endless heartbeat she was falling with it, the seed sacks and the crated mare shifting and screaming behind her, the gorge opening beneath like a mouth. She did not have time to be afraid. She had time only to throw herself sideways off the buckboard, toward the near bank, her hands clawing at splintering wood, and then a grip like an iron manacle closed around her forearm and hauled her up and out and over, so hard that her boots left the boards entirely before she landed hard against a chest as broad and unmovable as a granite outcrop. "Hold on to me," a voice said, low and rough as gravel, right against her ear. "Hold on and do not fight me." She had never in her life been told to hold onto a stranger, and obeyed so fast. Behind them, the middle span of the bridge folded downward into the gorge in a long groan of tearing timber, and the wagon went with it, canting, one wheel catching on the broken edge before the whole rig slid backward and downward into the white roar of the Pedra River 40 feet below. She heard her lead horse scream. She heard the crash of crates. She heard, distantly, her own voice shouting a name that was not yet a name she knew, because the man who held her had not told her who he was. When the wagon struck the water and rolled and was swallowed by the current, Augusta Fletcher went still in the stranger's arms, shaking, staring at the place where her life's work had just vanished into white water, and she said, in a voice gone thin with shock, "My horses." "I know," the man said. "I saw them go in harnessed. That gives them a chance the river would not give them loose." She twisted in his grip to look at him properly for the first time, and found herself looking up a long way, because he was built like something meant to hold up a roof. Broad through the shoulders in a manner that seemed unnatural for a single man to carry unassisted. His flannel shirt sleeves rolled to reveal forearms roped with muscle and old white scars. His hair longer than fashion allowed for townsmen, dark and shot through with a few threads of early gray, tied back at the neck with a leather cord. His jaw was shadowed with several days' growth, his eyes a startling pale gray, like river ice, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware that her hands were still fisted in his shirt front. "You are not hurt," he said. It was not quite a question. "I do not know yet," she said honestly, and stepped back from him, testing her footing on the solid bank, only to feel her knees threaten to give, and his hand came to her elbow again, not gripping this time, only steadying. "Sit down before you decide you are not hurt and prove yourself wrong," he said. "I am not in the habit of taking orders from men I have not been introduced to." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Harlan Bass," he said. "I guide folks through this country. Bridges, passes, weather the occasional bear. Sit down anyway." She sat. Not because he told her to, she informed herself firmly, but because her legs had made the decision without consulting her opinion on the matter. "Augusta Fletcher," she said, when the world had stopped tilting. "Fletcher seed and stock out of Del Norte. I was bringing grain seed and 2 Morgan horses over the pass to Currant Creek before the snow closes it. And now I have neither grain nor horses nor a wagon. And I am going to need every one of those things back, Mr. Bass. So if you have any notion of how a person retrieves cargo from the bottom of a river, I would be obliged to hear it." He studied her for a long moment, gray eyes moving over her mud-streaked coat, her white knuckles, the set of her jaw that refused to let itself tremble even though everything else in her was shaking, and whatever he had expected from a woman he'd just hauled off a collapsing bridge, it apparently was not this. "That bridge did not fall because of rot," he said instead of answering her question directly. "What? I have crossed that bridge every autumn for 6 years. Those support beams were sound in the spring. I want to have a look before this river current or your own good sense talks you out of caring." He was right that she cared. She followed him back to the shattered end of the bridge, her legs steadier now, anger doing what fear could not and putting iron back into her spine, and together they crouched at the broken edge where the middle span had given way, and Harlan Bass ran his thick fingers along the splintered face of the main support timber and went very still. This was cut, he said. Not sawed through clean, they were not fools. They wanted it to look like age and weather did the work. But see here, where the grain runs against the cut instead of with it. Somebody took an axe to 3/4 of this beam and left the rest to snap under the next heavy load that crossed it. Augusta looked at the mark he traced and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the river's chill. You are telling me someone did this on purpose. I am telling you someone wanted this bridge to fail, and they did not care who was on it when it did. Behind him, downriver, she could see a piece of her wagon canvas snagged on a boulder in the current, torn and streaming water. Somewhere in that violence, her breeding mare and her stallion, Copper, were fighting the river or had already lost the fight, and 1,100 pounds of seed grain that the valley beyond the pass needed for spring planting was scattering itself across the riverbed. She had signed contracts on that grain. She had put every dollar of credit her father's name still carried into those 2 Morgan horses, and someone had done this on purpose. Who, she said, would want to isolate this valley? Harlan Bass looked at her with something new in his pale eyes, an assessment that had shifted from concern for an injured stranger into something closer to respect. That, he said, is exactly the question I intend to answer. But first we are going downriver, because if those horses of yours made it to slack water, they will need finding before dark, and you look like a woman who would rather search a freezing river than sit safely on this bank being told to wait. I would, Augusta said. How did you know that? Lucky guess, he said, and there was, for just a moment, something almost warm in his voice before the mountain man's careful reserve closed back over it like a door. They found the mare first, a half-mile downstream, trembling and blowing in a shallow eddy where she had washed up against a gravel bar, still tangled in harness leather that had probably saved her life by fouling on a submerged log, and holding her against the current instead of letting her drown in the depths. Augusta waded in without hesitation, skirts and all, ignoring Harlan's sharp warning behind her, and got a hand on the mare's halter and talked to her low and steady, the way her father had taught her before she was old enough to reach a saddle unassisted, until the animal's wild eye softened and she let herself be led, stumbling, up onto the bank. You could have been swept off your feet in there, Harlan said, hauling on the lead rope from the bank to help guide the exhausted animal the last few feet. I was not, Augusta said, and she is worth the risk. She is the last of her dam's line, and half of what I owe against this trip rides on her getting to Currant Creek alive. He looked at her for a long moment, the mare's steaming breath fogging between them, and did not argue further, though she could see the argument sitting behind his teeth, held there with visible effort. They found Copper an hour later, and it took both of them ropes and no small amount of profanity from Harlan Bass to get the panicked stallion up out of a deep pool where he had wedged himself against a fallen tree. But they got him, shaking and cut along one flank but sound on his legs, and Augusta pressed her face briefly against the horse's wet neck and did not try to hide that her eyes were stinging. Your grain is gone, Harlan said quietly, not unkindly, once the horses were secured. Most of it, I am sorry for it. Some of it may be salvageable if the sacks did not split, she said, but that is a problem for tomorrow's light, not tonight's dark. Tonight I need a place these 2 can stand out of the wind, and I do not suppose you know of one, since you seem to know everything else about this country. I know of one, Harlan Bass said. It happens to be mine. Harlan Bass's cabin sat in a fold of the mountain above the ruined bridge, close enough to the pass road that he could see travelers coming for a full day before they reached him, which he told her was the entire point of building where he had. It was a solid structure of squared logs with a stone chimney and a lean-to barn attached at one end, and when Augusta led her 2 shivering horses into the shelter of that barn and saw the clean straw, the sound roof, the neat rows of tools hung with the particular care of a man who trusted his own hands more than he trusted most people, she understood something about Harlan Bass that his silence had not yet told her. You built all this yourself, she said. had help raising the roof beams. The rest, yes. He forked hay into the stalls with economical, powerful movements, muscles shifting under his shirt in a way that Augusta found herself watching for longer than was strictly necessary before she caught herself at it, and looked instead at the stallion's injured flank, which needed tending and gave her something useful to do with her eyes. "I have salve in my saddlebag if it survived the river," she said. "For the cut, I have salve here that will serve. You do not need to ruin your own supplies on a horse that is not yours to tend anymore, not tonight. He is entirely mine to tend, Mr. Bass. He belongs to me until the moment I hand his lead rope to the rancher in Currant Creek who paid for him, and even then I imagine I will worry after him. That is not a habit I am willing to set aside because a bridge fell out from under me today." He looked at her, and this time the ghost of a smile reached his eyes as well as his mouth. "No," he said, "I do not imagine it is." Inside the cabin, over a supper of beans and hard bread and coffee strong enough to strip paint, Augusta Fletcher and Harlan Bass took each other's measure properly for the first time, firelight throwing his shadow huge against the log wall, and she found herself doing more of the talking than she had intended, telling him about her father's death 2 winters past, about the seed and stock business she had kept running rather than sell to the first man who offered, about the particular stubbornness required to run freight wagons through mountain country as an unmarried woman, when half the men in Del Norte assumed she would fail, and the other half assumed she would marry the first one who offered to do the failing for her. "And you," she said finally, turning the question back on him because it seemed only fair and because she wanted to know. "Everyone I asked about a guide for this pass gave me your name before any other. Harlan Bass, they said, brings folks home safe when nobody else will try the route. That is a reputation a man does not build by accident." He was quiet for a moment, turning his tin coffee cup slowly in those large hands, and when he spoke his voice had gone lower, rougher at the edges. "I brought a party through in '74 that another guide had already tried and lost 2 men to, in weather that should have killed the rest of us as well. After that, word travels. I do not go looking for the reputation. I go looking for people who are lost and bring them back if I can, because I know what it is to be the one waiting on someone who does not come home." There was a whole history folded into that last sentence that she did not ask him to unfold, sensing that it was not yet hers to ask for, but she filed it away, the way she filed away the small facts of any good horse trade, waiting to see what more it would tell her over time. "Well," she said instead, "you brought me home safe today, in a manner of speaking, though you did lose most of my seed grain to the river in the process." "I did not lose it. The saboteur lost it for you. I only kept you from following it." "A fair distinction," she allowed, and for the first time since the bridge gave way beneath her, Augusta Fletcher laughed, and the sound of it in that small, fire-lit cabin seemed to surprise them both. She slept that night in the cabin's single narrow bed, while Harlan Bass rolled himself in a blanket by the hearth, insisting with a bluntness that brooked no argument that he had slept on worse ground than his own floor 100 times and would sleep there again. And if she meant to argue the point, she could do it after she had slept, because arguing on no sleep never won anybody anything worth winning. She had opened her mouth to argue anyway out of pure principle, and then closed it again, because she was tired down to her bones and he was, annoyingly, correct. In the morning they went back to the river in the cold gray light and recovered 4 of the 11 seed sacks, soaked through but the grain inside mostly whole, and Harlan spread them on canvas in the thin autumn sun to dry, while Augusta walked the bank looking for more. And it was there, examining a length of rope still tied to a broken bridge timber that had washed up against a snag, that she found the second thing that told her the bridge's failure had been no accident at all. "Harlan," she called, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and neither of them remarked on it, though something passed between them at the sound of it that had not been there before. "Look at this." He crossed the gravel to her side and took the rope from her hands. It was new cordage, not the weathered hemp that had rigged the old bridge, and knotted to it was a strip of oilcloth stamped with a faded brand mark, a stylized letter C inside a circle. "Croft," Harlan said, and his voice had gone flat and hard as flint. "That is Silas Croft's mark. He runs freight out of Pagosa Way and owns the ferry crossing downriver besides. Why would a freight man want to destroy a bridge that other freight uses? Because if the bridge is gone and there is no other way through the pass for wheeled traffic before the snow closes it, every wagon bound for Currant Creek and the mining camps beyond it has exactly one way over this river left standing, and that is his ferry, at his price, on his schedule." Harlan's jaw was tight enough that a muscle stood out along it. "I have heard whispers all summer that Croft was buying up notes on land and stock in the valley cheap, betting folks would go under if supplies got scarce enough. I did not want to believe a man would cut a bridge to make that bet pay faster." "Then we had better go and look at his ferry," Augusta said, "before we decide anything else." "We," he repeated, with the particular emphasis of a man unused to sharing a decision. "You may go alone if you prefer, Mr. Bass, but I have a contract to fulfill and 2 horses and 4 sacks of grain that still need to reach Currant Creek before the snow shuts that valley off from the rest of the world, and I intend to find out exactly how bad my situation has become before I decide what to do about it. That requires seeing the ferry with my own eyes, not hearing about it from yours." He looked at her for a long beat, and she watched him visibly decide in real time not to argue the point, which she suspected cost him some effort, given the set of his shoulders. "All right," he said. The ferry crossing lay 6 miles downriver at a place called Loomy's Bend, and they rode there together the next day, Augusta on the recovered mare and Harlan on a sturdy bay gelding he kept in the Linta barn, Copper led behind on a lead line to spare his cut flank further strain. They found the ferry itself sitting half-sunk at its mooring, its guide cable snapped and coiled in the shallows like a dead snake, and a hired man loitering at the bank who identified himself, when pressed, as working for Croft Freight and Mercantile, and who grew suddenly very interested in the state of his own boots when Harlan asked him how a steel cable came to snap clean rather than fray. "Storm did it," the man said, not meeting either of their eyes. "Big storm 2 weeks back." "There was no storm 2 weeks back fierce enough to part a half-inch cable," Harlan said, "and you know it, and I expect Silas Croft knows it better than either of us." The hired man said nothing further, only mounted his own horse and rode off toward Pagosa at a pace that suggested he had urgent news to deliver, and Augusta watched him go with her stomach sinking, because if Croft's own man was already riding to warn him, then whatever quiet investigating she and Harlan Bass had hoped to do was no longer quiet at all. "He will know we are asking questions before nightfall," she said. "Yes. Then we do not have the luxury of waiting until spring thaw to sort this out. If the bridge is gone and the ferry is gone, there is exactly one way left over this mountain before the snow closes it for the season, and that is the pass trail itself, on horseback and pack animal only, no wagon, and I have contracts to fill that depend on wheels and weight, not saddlebags." "Then we will need another wagon," Harlan said, "and another route to bring it in by, and we will need to move faster than Silas Croft expects anyone in this valley to move, because right now he believes he has closed every door but his own." "You keep saying we," Augusta observed. "I do," he agreed, and did not apologize for it, and something in the plainness of the way he said it settled warm and unfamiliar in her chest, though she was careful not to examine the feeling too closely. Not yet, not with a saboteur's business still unfinished, and a valley's winter supplies hanging on what came next. They rode back toward his cabin as the light went long and gold across the aspen groves, the whole mountainside a blaze of yellow and rust-orange leaves that made the country look gentler than it had any right to look, given what it had already tried to do to her wagon, and Augusta found herself glancing sideways at Harlan Bass more than the scenery strictly warranted. At the easy, powerful way he sat his horse, at the set of his jaw when he was thinking through a problem, at the surprising gentleness with which those same broad, scarred hands had checked Copper's healing flank that morning before they left, murmuring something low to the horse that she had not quite caught but that had made the stallion's ears flick forward in something like trust. "You are staring," Harlan said without turning his head. "I am assessing," she said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "There is when I am the one doing it," she said, and heard him laugh, low and short and surprised out of him, as though laughter were a muscle he did not exercise often enough to trust it, and the sound of it pleased her far more than she was prepared to admit. That night back at the cabin, they worked out a plan by lamplight while the wind picked up outside and rattled the shutters. And Augusta laid out a route on Harlan's hand-drawn map that would bring a replacement wagon and fresh supplies up from Del Norte by a longer southern trail, avoiding both the ruined bridge and Croft's Ferry entirely. Time to meet them at a way-station cabin 2 days below the pass, where a widow named Nell Odell kept a small trading post and let travelers shelter for a fee. "I know Nell," Harlan said. "Good woman. Took in a boy this past spring after a ferry accident downriver drowned his folks, and she has been raising him since, though it is a hard stretch for a woman her age, and there is no family to help her with it." Something in the careful way he said it made Augusta look up from the map. "A ferry accident," she repeated. Harlan's gray eyes met hers, and she saw the same cold understanding settle there that had already settled in her own chest. The old ferry, before Croft bought the crossing and built the new one, might be nothing. Might be Croft has been at this longer than one autumn. "That poor child," Augusta said quietly, and thought of her own father, of the particular hollow ache of losing the person who had built your whole world, and something in her hardened toward Silas Croft that had nothing to do with lost seed grain or a ruined wagon, and everything to do with a boy she had not yet met. They reached Nell Odell's way station 2 days later, having ridden the long way around with the horses and left word with a rider bound for Del Norte to arrange the replacement wagon. And the cabin they found there was small and neat, smoke curling from its chimney into a sky gone the deep hard blue that Harlan told her. With a note of professional concern he did not bother to hide. Usually meant a change in the weather was coming sooner than the calendar promised. The boy who opened the door before they had even dismounted was perhaps 9 years old, thin, watchful in the particular way of a child who has already learned that the world can take things from you without warning, and he looked at Harlan first with open relief and then at Augusta with careful, measuring curiosity. "Mr. Bass," he said, "Aunt Nell said you would come by before the snow. Who is she?" "This is Miss Augusta Fletcher, Eli. She is a seed merchant and a very fine horsewoman, and she had a bridge collapse out from under her wagon 4 days ago and did not so much as blink about it." "I blinked," Augusta said. "I simply did not scream, which I am told is a separate accomplishment." Eli considered this with the grave seriousness of a boy deciding whether an adult was worth his trust, and then, apparently satisfied, said, "Aunt Nell has stew. You should come in before it gets cold and before the wind gets worse. It has been smelling like snow since yesterday." "Smelling like snow," Augusta repeated, amused, as they led the horses toward the small barn. "He is not wrong," Harlan said, no humor in it now, scanning the sky with the same measuring look he'd give a strange trail. "That boy has spent more time in these mountains this past year than most grown men manage in 5. If Eli says it smells like snow, I would not wager against him." Inside, over stew and cornbread, Nell Odell proved to be a wiry, sharp-eyed woman well past 60 who ran her small trading post with the brisk efficiency of someone who had buried a husband and outlived 2 business partners, and did not intend to let a mountain valley get the better of her regardless. She listened to their account of the bridge and the ferry with her mouth thinning into a hard line, and when they mentioned Croft's mark on the recovered rope, she set down her spoon with a clatter. "That man has been sending riders through here all summer asking who still owes notes to whom, and offering to buy up trading post supply contracts at half what they are worth, on account of how hard it will be to get goods over the pass this winter," she said. I told him my post was not for sale, and he smiled at me like I had told him a very good joke, and I did not care for the smile one bit. "Did he say anything else?" Harlan asked. "Anything that might help us prove what he has done, rather than only suspect it." Nell considered, then shook her head slowly. "Not that I recall clear enough to swear to in front of a judge. Croft is careful with what he lets slip in front of witnesses. But his freight clerk, a young fellow named of Warren, he has a loose tongue after a second whiskey, and he passes through here most weeks." "Then perhaps," Augusta said, "we ought to be here the next time he passes through." Outside later, while Harlan checked the horse's shoes by lantern light before the weather could close in, Augusta found Eli sitting on an overturned crate near the barn door, watching the last color drain out of the sky above the ridgeline, and she sat down beside him without being asked, because she recognized something in the set of his small shoulders that she had worn on her own shoulders once, in the weeks after her father died. "You miss them," she said. Not a question. Eli did not look at her. "Everybody says the ferry rope was old, that it was just bad luck." His voice was very steady, in the way of a child who has practiced being steady because the alternative frightens him. "But Aunt Nell does not think it was bad luck, and Mr. Bass does not either, I can tell. Nobody will just say it out plain, though." Augusta was quiet a moment, weighing the truth against the comfort of a lie, and chose, because she thought he deserved it, the truth. "I do not know for certain what happened to your parents' ferry, Eli. But I know a bridge fell under my wagon 4 days ago that had no business falling, and I know it had a mark on it belonging to a man named Silas Croft, and I intend to find out the whole truth of what he has done in this valley, this year and any year before it. If that truth touches what happened to your family, you will hear it from me plain, not softened." Eli looked at her then, really looked, and something in his thin face eased very slightly, as though the plain promise of honesty was a heavier comfort than any gentle lie could have been. "Aunt Nell is getting old," he said, apropos of nothing and everything. "She does not say so, but I can tell. Her hands shake worse in the cold now." "I noticed," Augusta said gently, because she had. "I do not know what happens to me if she cannot keep the post going any more." He said it without self-pity, only as a fact he had already turned over many times alone in the dark, and it struck Augusta somewhere deep and unguarded, and she found she could not answer him honestly with any comfort at all, because she did not know either, and did not think it was her place yet to make promises about a boy's future that she had no standing to keep. "I do not know that either," she said instead. "But I know you are not alone tonight, and I do not intend to forget you the moment I ride out of this valley, whatever happens with Silas Croft." It was not much of a promise, as promises went, but Eli seemed to weigh it and find it sufficient, and he nodded once and went inside to help Nell bank the fire, and Augusta sat a while longer in the cold, thinking about ferry ropes and cut bridge beams and a boy who noticed his aunt's shaking hands, and did not hear Harlan Bass come to stand behind her until his voice, low, broke the quiet. "He does not talk to most folks that easy. He is a good boy," Augusta said. "He deserves better than he has gotten this year." "Most people do," Harlan said, "and most of them do not get it. It is a fine thing when someone tries to see they do anyway." He was looking at her when he said it, not at the cabin, and Augusta felt the weight of that look settle somewhere warm beneath her ribs, and she did not look away from it either. The replacement wagon arrived from Del Norte 4 days later, along with fresh seed grain to replace what the river had taken, and a hired teamster who Augusta paid off and sent home once she judged the mountain roads too uncertain for a man unfamiliar with them, over Harlan's immediate and vocal objection. "You cannot drive that wagon over the pass alone," he said, standing in Nell Odell's dooryard with his arms crossed over his chest like a man bracing against weather that had not yet arrived. "Not with weather building the way it is building. I will drive it." "You will guide it," Augusta said. "There is a difference, and I would ask you to notice it, because I have driven freight wagons through worse mountains than these since I was 17 years old, and I do not intend to hand my father's business over to a man's good intentions the first time the road gets steep. This is not about intentions, it is about sense. That pass has killed experienced freighters in weather far milder than what is coming. Then you had better teach me what you know about that pass instead of trying to take the reins out of my hands, because I am the one who signed the delivery contract. I am the one who knows exactly how this seed grain needs to be loaded to keep it dry, and I am the one who will be driving it, Mr. Bass, whether you approve or not. The silence that followed was long enough that Eli, watching from the porch step with wide eyes, later told Nell it had gotten so quiet he could hear the horses breathing all the way from the barn. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever guided through this country," Harlan said finally, and there was frustration in it, but underneath the frustration unmistakably, something that sounded almost like admiration fighting its way free despite him. "I have been told that before," Augusta said. "It has never once made me less right." He laughed then, short and rough and real, shaking his head, and some of the tension went out of his broad shoulders. "All right, Miss Fletcher, you drive. I will ride ahead and mark the safe ground, and warn you when the ground stops being safe, and you will listen to that warning even if it costs you time you do not want to lose. That much I will insist upon." "That," Augusta said, "I can agree to." It was, she recognized even as she said it, not quite the surrender he had first wanted, and not quite the full partnership she wanted either, but a middle ground both of them could stand on without resentment, and she saw in the set of his face that he understood the difference too, and that something had shifted a small but real amount in how he meant to treat her going forward. They set out the next morning under a sky the color of hammered pewter, the aspens along the trail still blazing gold and orange, a beauty so vivid it seemed to argue against the cold bite in the wind, and it was that very beauty, Harlan told her grimly as they climbed, that made this kind of weather so dangerous. "Folks look at leaves like that and think the season is gentle yet," he said, riding a length ahead of the wagon, scanning the ridgelines with a habitual, unhurried thoroughness. "Meanwhile, the first heavy snow of the year is building up behind that ridge, and it does not care one bit how pretty the aspens are. How do you know it is building and not simply cloud? Wind smell. Bird behavior. The way the light comes through that cloud bank instead of around it. 20 years in these mountains teaches a man things his eyes stop needing words for." He glanced back at her, seated straight and capable on the wagon box, reins competent in her gloved hands, and something in his gaze softened. "I could teach you some of it if you wanted learning." "I would like that," Augusta said, surprised to find she meant it entirely, and pleased more than she examined too closely that he had offered to teach rather than simply to know better than her. They made good progress that first day, and camped that night in a stand of spruce below the true climb to the pass, and it was there, over a small fire built in the lee of a boulder to hide its light from the trail below, that Harlan Bass told her, without her asking directly this time, why he had built his reputation on bringing people home. "My brother was a guide before me," he said, staring into the flames, his big hands loose and still on his knees. "Taught me everything I know about this country. 14 years back, he took a party through Marshall Pass in weather he judged wrong, and only he did not come home. I was 20 years old and I had to go tell his wife myself, and I have never forgotten the particular way a person's face changes when they understand, all at once, that the person they love is not coming back. I am sorry," Augusta said quietly. "After that I decided I would rather be too careful than wrong even once. That is why I push so hard to be the one making the call on the trail. It is not that I think a woman cannot judge weather or ground as well as a man. It is that I have stood in a doorway and told a wife her husband was dead because a guide judged wrong, and I have sworn to myself, I will not be the reason that doorway opens for anybody else, ever, if I can help it." Augusta was quiet a long moment, turning that over with the care it deserved, and then she said gently, "That is a heavy thing to carry alone for 14 years. But Harlan, You cannot carry it by deciding for every person you ever guide that they are not allowed a voice in their own risk. That is not keeping them safe. That is only keeping yourself from having to trust anyone else's judgment but your own, and I do not think that is the same thing, even if it feels the same from inside your own chest. He looked at her across the firelight for a long, searching moment, and something in his hard-held composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to see the tired, grieving young man of 20 still living somewhere under the mountain man he had built himself into. "No," he said finally, quietly. "I do not suppose it is." "For what it is worth," she added, "I do not think you would have told your brother's wife anything different than the plain truth, whatever it cost you, and I would rather have a guide who tells me the plain truth about danger and trusts me to weigh it, than one who decides for me and calls it kindness." "I am trying," Harlan said. "It does not come natural yet." "I noticed," Augusta said, and this time when she smiled at him, he smiled back without the careful reserve he usually kept behind his eyes, and something passed between them in the firelight, warm and unhurried and entirely new, that neither of them named aloud, but that both of them felt settle quietly into the space between their two bedrolls. The wind changed in the night. Augusta woke to it, a low moaning through the spruce that had not been there when she fell asleep, and found Harlan already awake, standing at the edge of their small camp, face turned up toward a sky that had gone from pewter to iron, thick low clouds moving fast against the moon. "It is coming early," he said when he heard her stir. "Faster than I judged. We need to move at first light, and we need to move fast, or that pass will close on us with the wagon still on the wrong side of it." They broke camp before the sky had fully lightened, and pushed the team hard up the switchbacking trail as the wind rose steadily around them, the temperature dropping with a speed that made Augusta's breath fog thick in front of her face. And by mid-morning the first snow began to fall, fine and dry and driving sideways on the wind. The kind of snow, Harlan called back to her grimly, that meant business rather than beauty. It was on the exposed shoulder of the mountain, where the trail narrowed between a rock face on one side and a long steep drop on the other, that disaster nearly repeated itself. The lead horse shied hard at a sudden gust that brought a spray of loose snow and gravel down from above, and the wagon lurched, one wheel catching the trail's crumbling edge, and Augusta hauled the team hard left with every ounce of strength and skill her father had ever taught her, fighting the wagon back onto solid ground even as her heart slammed against her ribs, and it held, the wheels finding purchase again, the wagon steadying, and she realized only afterward that she had not screamed, had not called for Harlan, had solved it herself with her own two hands on the reins, exactly as she had insisted she could. Harlan had wheeled his horse back at the first lurch, face gone white beneath his weathered tan, and he reached her side just as the wagon settled, and for a moment he only stared at her, chest heaving as though he could not quite believe what he had just watched. "You held it," he said. "I told you I would. I know you told me. I did not know I would have to watch you nearly go over a drop to believe it." His voice was rough, and his hand, when it came up to grip her shoulder, was not quite steady. "Augusta, I have never in my life watched anyone handle a team like that on ground like this." "High praise," she said, though her own voice shook slightly now that the danger had passed, and her body had caught up to what her hands had already done. "Though I would rather not repeat the demonstration if it is all the same to you." "It is entirely the same to me," Harlan said fervently, and something in the rawness of his relief, the honest fear that had been on his face before he saw she was safe, told her more plainly than any speech could have that whatever careful distance he had been keeping between them was eroding fast, and not only on her side. They pushed on through worsening snow, the trail growing harder to read by the hour as fresh white covered old landmarks, and it was near the highest point of the pass, in a narrow defile between two steep snow-loaded slopes, that Harlan called a sudden, sharp halt, throwing up his hand. "Stop the team. Do not move. Listen." Augusta reined in and listened, and heard nothing at first but wind, And then beneath the wind, a low groaning creak that seemed to come from the mountain itself, a sound like a great weight settling. "That slope on the left has taken on more snow than it can hold," Harlan said quietly, not moving, his eyes fixed on the white expanse above them. "We are not crossing under it. There is another way longer along the tree line, but it will add 3 hours we do not have much daylight left to spend." "Then we spend them," Augusta said without hesitation. "I would rather arrive after dark than not arrive at all." They turned the wagon and took the longer route, and it was slow, careful work through drifting snow and tangled deadfall. And full dark had long since fallen, and the storm had grown into a true blizzard, wind screaming across open ground and visibility, dropping to a few wagon lengths. When the axle struck a buried rock hidden beneath the drifted snow and cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and the wagon canted hard to one side and would go no further. They were, Harlan judged grimly by lantern light, still 2 miles from the shelter of the far side way station, with a broken axle, a blizzard closing in around them, and no way to move the wagon another foot that night. "We cannot leave the seed grain," Augusta said, teeth chattering now despite her heavy coat, the temperature having plunged with the full dark. "If it freezes and gets wet again when it thaws, it will rot before spring planting, and that valley needs it." "We are not leaving the seed grain, and we are not leaving you either," Harlan said, already working fast, unhitching the team, throwing a canvas tarp over the wagon bed to shelter the grain sacks from the worst of the driving snow. "There is an old trapper's line shack 1/2 mile off this trail, cut into the hillside. I have used it before. We cannot reach the way station tonight, but we can reach that." They led the horses through the screaming wind and blinding snow, Augusta gripping Copper's lead rope with hands gone numb inside her gloves, following the broad, sure shape of Harlan ahead of her because she could see almost nothing else in the whiteout, trusting entirely in that moment that he knew this ground well enough to find shelter in it even blind. And he did not fail her, the low dark shape of the line shack rising up out of the storm at last like a mercy. Inside, with the horses crowded into a lean-to at the shack's rear and a small fire finally catching in the ancient stone hearth, Augusta sat shivering under every blanket Harlan could find, and he sat close beside her, rubbing warmth back into her stiff hands between his own, his gray eyes dark with worry in the firelight. "You are supposed to tell me the plain truth about danger and trust me to weigh it," she said, through chattering teeth, trying for lightness and only half managing it. "So tell me plainly," Harlan bass. "How bad is this?" "Bad enough that I am glad neither of us is out there alone," he said, quiet and honest. "But we have shelter, fire, and horses, and this storm will not last past morning at this intensity. Storms this fierce this early in the season tend to blow themselves out fast. We will survive the night. Tomorrow we deal with the axle and the last 2 miles. And the grain, the tarp will hold. I have seen worse weather fail to soak through good old canvas." He hesitated, then added low, "I was more frightened for you tonight than I have been for anyone in a long while, Augusta. I want you to know that plain, since plain truth seems to be the coin we deal in now." She looked up at him, firelight warm on the strong planes of his face, on the pale eyes that had gone soft and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him, and something in her chest, already leaning toward him for days, tipped fully over into certainty. "I was frightened too," she admitted. "But not once tonight was I frightened of being alone in it because you were beside me. That is not a small thing, Harlan. I have been alone with my fear a long time now since my father died. I did not expect to stop being alone with it on a mountain pass in a blizzard, with a broken axle and a wagon full of seed grain, but here I am." He raised one broad, scarred hand and brushed a strand of half-frozen hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed almost unbearable coming from a man built like a stone wall, and said her name, just her name, low and rough, before he kissed her. It was not a hurried kiss, nor a desperate one born only of cold and fear and the nearness of survived danger, though all of that lived somewhere underneath it. It was slow and searching, and careful in the particular way of a man handling something he had already decided mattered a very great deal. And Augusta Fletcher, who had spent 2 years since her father's death being careful and capable and entirely, deliberately alone, found herself leaning into it without a single one of the careful reservations she had built her whole life around. When they finally drew apart, Harlan's forehead rested against hers, his breathing unsteady, and he said, "I do not do that lightly. I want you to know that as well." "I did not imagine you did," Augusta said. "I do not do it lightly either." Outside, the storm howled on through the small hours, but inside the lined shack, wrapped in blankets and firelight in each other, they weathered it together, and something unspoken but entirely mutual settled between them before the fire finally burned down to embers and exhaustion claimed them both. The storm broke by mid-morning, exactly as Harlan had predicted, leaving the world outside buried in nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, brilliant and blinding under a sky scoured clean and impossibly blue. They spent the day repairing the axle with tools from the shack and a spare Harlan kept, by long habit, in his own saddle roll, and by the following afternoon they had the wagon moving again, slow and careful through the drifted snow, and reached the far side way station cabin 2 days later than planned, but with every sack of seed grain dry and every horse sound. But their trouble was not finished, because it was at that way station, run by a cousin of Nell Odell's named Robert Tanner, that they learned Silas Croft had ridden through only a day before, offering, in the wake of the storm, to buy up desperate ranchers' notes at a fraction of their value, insisting that with both the bridge and ferry gone, and the pass now impassable for wheeled freight until spring, the valley had no choice but to accept his terms for whatever goods came through his mercantile at whatever price he set. "He is already spreading word the pass is closed for the season," Robert Tanner told them, worry heavy in his voice. "Half the ranchers up the valley are ready to sign whatever he puts in front of them because they believe him." "Then we had better make certain the whole valley knows the pass is not closed," Augusta said, "because we just brought a wagon through it, and we intend to make sure everyone from here to Currant Creek hears exactly how, and exactly who cut that bridge to make them believe otherwise." They reached Currant Creek 3 days later, seed grain intact, both Morgan horses sound and delivered to the rancher who had contracted for them, and the news of Augusta Fletcher's wagon crossing the supposedly impassable pass spread through the valley faster than the season's first true snow had. Ranchers who had been on the verge of signing away their notes to Silas Croft began asking harder questions, and it was in the valley's small church hall, called into an impromptu meeting by an furious Nell Odell who had ridden in specially with Eli beside her, that the truth of the bridge and the ferry was laid out plain before the whole assembled community, Harlan producing the cut beam evidence and the marked rope, Augusta producing signed testimony from Robert Tanner about the notes Croft had been buying, and Eli, small and steady beside Nell, telling the room quietly what he remembered of the old ferry rope his father had once mentioned looking frayed weeks before the accident that took both his parents, a detail nobody had thought significant until it was set beside cut bridge timbers and severed steel cable, and a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence any longer. Silas Croft, confronted at that meeting by a valley's worth of angry ranchers and a territorial marshal sent for from Pagosa Springs once word reached that far, did not confess so much as flee, riding hard for the territorial line before the marshal's deputies could reach his mercantile. But he left behind ledgers in his own hand detailing the notes he had bought and the plan he had built around isolating the valley. Evidence enough that the marshal assured the assembled crowd would see him arrested the moment he surfaced in any town with a working telegraph line, and enough, more immediately, to void every note he had pressured desperate ranchers into signing under false claims about the pass. It was, Augusta thought, watching the relief spread through that crowded little church hall, a satisfying end to a wicked scheme, but it was not. She understood with sudden clarity, watching Eli's face as the marshal spoke, an end that gave the boy his parents back, or gave Nell Odell back the strength in her hands. And some griefs did not close simply because the man who caused them had been exposed and had run. Winter settled properly over the valley in the weeks that followed. The pass closing at last to wagon traffic exactly on the schedule the season demanded rather than the schedule Silas Croft had tried to force early. And Harlan Bass, his guiding season done for the year, found reasons to stay near Currant Creek rather than retreat to his solitary cabin as he had done every winter before. Reasons that had a great deal to do with a seed merchant who had decided, in the wake of the pass crossing, to winter over in the valley herself rather than risk the return journey until spring travel was safer, and who had taken rooms at Nell Odell's way station rather than push further south alone. Their courtship through that winter was unhurried in a way that surprised them both, built less on grand gestures than on small accumulated trust. Harlan teaching her to read weather in the shape of clouds over the ridgeline, Augusta teaching him the finer points of assessing a horse's soundness by the way it favored a hoof in soft snow. Long evenings at Nell's table with Eli between them arguing happily over checkers. Quiet walks in the brief golden hours before winter dusk when the whole valley lay hushed and white, and the two of them talked, unhurried, about the particular shape their lives might take if they chose to build one together, rather than two lives running parallel but separate. It was in late January, during a hard cold snap that had the whole valley bundled tight against the wind, that the second true test of that trust arrived, and it arrived, fittingly, with a sound rather than a sight. Eli had gone up the near ridge with two of the older Tanner boys to check a rabbit snare line, against Nell's mild objection, and with the casual confidence of a boy who knew that stretch of hillside as well as he knew his own hands, and the boys had not returned by the time the light began to fail, and Nell's mild worry sharpened fast into real fear when a distant, muffled boom rolled down off the mountain, followed by a long, grinding roar that every soul in that valley, who had wintered there more than a season, recognized instantly for what it was. "Slide," Harlan said, already moving for the door before the sound had finished echoing, snatching down his coiled rescue rope and the long-handled shovel he kept by habit near the hearth. That came off the north bowl above the snare line. Augusta was already pulling on her coat behind him. "Then that is exactly where those boys were headed." "Augusta, this is not." "It is exactly my business, Harlan Bass, because I know that hillside as well as you do by now, and because Eli is my business whether you like the phrase or not, and because you taught me yourself how to read avalanche danger in snow this winter. So do not waste breath telling me to stay behind when we both know I can be useful." He looked at her for one taut second, and then, remarkably, did not argue further, only said, "Bring the extra rope and the horn." And she understood, with a small, fierce flare of gratitude, that this was exactly the partnership she had spent all autumn earning from him, offered now without a fight at the moment it mattered most. They rode as far up the snow-choked slope as the horses could safely carry them, then went the rest on foot, snowshoes strapped hastily on, following the raw scar of the slide up through broken timber and churned snow, calling the boys' names into a silence that swallowed sound in the particular, deadened way fresh avalanche debris always did. Harlan moved fast and sure across the unstable snow, testing each section with the shovel handle before trusting his weight to it, and it was Augusta, standing still and listening hard, while he probed a suspicious depression near a stand of shattered spruce, who caught the faint, muffled bark of a dog, one of the Tanner boys' hounds that had gone up the mountain with them, coming from beneath a jumble of snow and broken branch some 30 yards to their left, not where Harlan had been focusing his search at all. "There," she said. "Harlan, there, the dog is under there, and if the dog is there, the boys likely are too. That hollow runs the same line as the snare trail. I walked it myself with Eli 2 weeks past." He did not question her, did not pause to weigh her judgment against his own trained instinct, only turned immediately and began probing where she pointed. And within minutes the shovel struck something solid that was not rock, and they dug fast and desperate through packed, heavy snow until they uncovered first the shivering, snow-caked dog. And then, beneath a lucky pocket of air the fallen spruce boughs had preserved, all three boys, cold and terrified but alive. One of the older Tanner boys with a badly wrenched ankle, but no worse injury among them. It was as they were hauling the last boy free, the light nearly gone and the cold deepening fast, that Augusta caught the sound she had learned to fear that whole hard winter. A low, settling groan from the slope above them, snow shifting under its own accumulated weight, the same warning sound Harlan had taught her to recognize on the pass crossing months before. "Harlan, move now. That whole shelf above us is going to go." He did not hesitate, scooping the injured boy up bodily against his chest and half carrying, half dragging him clear, while Augusta hauled the younger two by their coat collars toward the tree line. And they made it, all of them, off the unstable shelf and onto solid ground moments before a second. Smaller slide came down exactly where they had been standing, burying the spot where Harlan had first begun digging. He turned back and looked at that fresh scar of tumbled snow, and then at Augusta, breathing hard, snow in his hair, and understanding settled over his face slow and complete. "You heard that before I did," he said. "You called it before I did both times, first the dog and now the slide. If I had kept digging where I first thought to look, or if we had lingered a minute longer where we stood, that second slide would have taken us both." "You taught me to listen for it," Augusta said, equally breathless, equally shaken now that the danger had passed and the enormity of it was catching up to her. "I only used what you gave me." "You used it better than I did tonight," Harlan said, and there was no wounded pride in it at all, only plain, humbled wonder. "You saved my life up there, Augusta, as sure as I have ever saved anyone's on this mountain. I want you to hear me say that plain, the way we agreed to speak plain to each other." She reached up, cold-numbed fingers finding his jaw, snow melting between them where their faces nearly touched. "Then hear me say it back plain, Harlan Bass. We saved each other. That is the only way this has ever worked between us, since the day that bridge went out from under me. I do not want a protector who decides for me what I am capable of weighing. I want a partner who trusts what I bring to stand beside what he brings. Tonight you gave me exactly that, and it saved 4 lives, not just mine." They got the boys down the mountain and warm before true dark, Nell Odell weeping openly with relief when Eli came through her door shivering but whole. And it was 2 nights later, once the valley's fright had settled and the boys were pronounced fully recovered, that Harlan Bass came to Augusta as she sat by Nell's hearth mending a torn coat sleeve, and knelt, not with any grand speech prepared, only with the plain honesty that had become the whole foundation of what stood between them. "I have spent 14 years believing that loving anyone meant I had to carry every risk myself, decide every danger before it could touch the people I cared for. Because I could not survive watching someone I loved walk into harm I might have prevented if only I had insisted harder," he said. "You have shown me, this whole season, that a person can be loved fiercely and still be trusted to weigh her own risks, and that the loving is not weaker for the trusting, it is stronger. I do not want to guide you through your life the way I guide a wagon through a pass, Augusta. I want to walk beside you through it, and let you guide some of the ground I could never see on my own. I am asking you to marry me, and to build whatever comes next as 2 equal hands on the same reins, not one hand holding the other's back." Augusta set down her mending, her eyes bright, and said, "That is the finest thing anyone has ever asked me, Harlan Bass, and I would be a fool and a liar to pretend I have not been hoping you would ask it since a night in a line shack in a blizzard, when you kissed me and told me you did not do it lightly. Yes, 2 equal hands. I will marry you." They were wed in Currant Creek's small church that same spring, once the pass opened again to easy travel and word could reach Del Norte for the few kin and business associates Augusta wished to invite, Nell Odell standing as witness with tears openly running down her weathered face. And it was in the weeks following the wedding, when Nell's hands had begun to shake too badly some mornings to manage the trading post's ledgers or Eli's care without help, that the last piece of that hard winter found its natural close. "I'm not able to give that boy what he needs much longer," Nell admitted to Augusta one evening, voice heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with love. "My body is failing faster than my heart is ready to let go of him. I have thought on it a long while, and I would ask you and Harlan, if you are willing, to consider taking him in properly. He loves you both already. I have watched it grow all winter. I could not ask anyone else in this valley and trust the asking." Augusta did not need to consult Harlan to know his answer, though she did anyway that same night, and found his face had already gone soft and certain the moment she said Eli's name, as though he had been waiting, without quite letting himself hope for it, for exactly this question. "I have wanted to ask you the very same thing since the night we dug him and those other boys out of the snow," Harlan admitted. "I only did not know how to raise it, when Nell has loved him so well and so long." They asked Eli directly, sitting together at Nell's kitchen table, laying the choice plainly before him, the way both of them had learned to lay everything plainly before each other that whole hard season. And the boy, who had spent a year learning to carry grief steady and alone, looked between the two of them for a long, searching moment before something in his careful, watchful face finally, fully, broke open into something like unguarded hope. "I would like that," he said, voice thick. "I would like that very much if Aunt Nell does not mind, and if it is not just because you feel sorry for me." "It is not pity, Eli," Augusta said, taking his hand across the table. "It is that we love you and have for months now, and would be glad, every day, to have you under our roof." "Every day," Harlan echoed, and his big hand came to rest, gentle as it had ever been with an injured horse or a frightened woman on a collapsing bridge, over both of theirs joined together on the table. They settled that spring in a wide, sun-warmed cabin Harlan built with his own hands on a rise above Currant Creek, close enough to the valley's ranches that Augusta's seed and stock business could grow with the community it had once nearly failed to reach, close enough to the pass that Harlan's guiding work continued each season, though now, more often than not, with a partner riding beside him who knew the weather and the ground and the particular sound snow made when it meant to fall, and who had proven, on more than one hard mountain night, that she was every bit as capable of bringing a person safely home as he had ever been. Nell Odell kept her trading post another 6 years before finally retiring to live near them, welcomed without hesitation into the household she had helped, in her own quiet way, to build. And Eli grew up strong and steady between two people who had learned, across one long autumn and a hard winter, that love built on true partnership, rather than one heart carrying every risk alone, was the only kind of love sturdy enough to weather a mountain pass, a collapsing bridge, a buried avalanche, and every ordinary hard season that came after, standing. And on quiet evenings, when the aspens turned gold again on the ridge above Currant Creek, and the light slanted long and warm across the valley Silas Croft had once tried to close off from the world, Augusta Fletcher Bass would sometimes stand at her own dooryard and look toward the pass, remembering a bridge giving way beneath her and a stranger's iron grip closing around her arm, and think that she had never once, since that day, been snowbound or lost or alone in any way that mattered, because Harlan Bass had found her on that bridge, and had never, in all the years after, let go.